A reminder, the U.S. House returns at 6:30 p.m. Eastern for votes on three bills debated earlier, including one that imposes additional sanctions on Iran for human rights violations. Before that vote takes place, we'll show you the floor debate from earlier.
Mr. Speaker, in January, this body came together. It was a near unanimous vote to support the Iranian people who were engaged in legitimate protests against a very oppressive regime. I want to thank Mr. Mike McCall here, Chairman of the Homeland Security Committee, and Mr. Elliot Engel, the ranking member of our Committee on Foreign Affairs, for their engagement in this issue. And at the time, we were witnessing tens of thousands of Iranians who had taken to the streets in the largest demonstration that we had seen since the Green Revolution of 2009. The protests aimed at economic stagnation, aimed at widespread corruption, and people were talking about that all the time, aimed at the Revolutionary Guard Corps control over that economy because they had nationalized, seized so much of that economy. And quickly we saw that spread across Iran as Persians sought to exercise the fundamental right of freedom of expression, as people across that country of every ethnicity and every religion began to speak out. Many demonstrators shouted slogans aimed at Iran's costly support for Syria's Bashar al-Assad, if you recall from reading the press accounts. And they argued about the cost, the support that went to the terrorist groups such as Hezbollah. Predictably, the Iranian regime moved swiftly to quash the demonstrations and throttle social media. More than 1,000 Iranians were jailed, dozens were killed. House Resolution 676 condemned this brutal violence back in January, called for targeted sanctions to hold the regime to account. But today we act to make good on that call, because the bill before us today, Chairman McCall's H.R. 4744, requires the administration to determine whether senior Iranian officials should be sanctioned for human rights abuses. And it also requires determinations on whether Iranian businesses should be sanctioned for public corruption with respect to those that are involved in corruption. And it mandates sanctions on those officials responsible for Iran's wrongful, politically motivated jailing of U.S. citizens. Mr. Speaker, for years the regime in Tehran has systematically beat down all opposition inside Iran. It regularly uses brutal tactics back in Iran, including torture and mass executions, as it seeks to export violence and radical ideology abroad as well. I think all of us can think back to that 1979 revolution and contemplate how much better Iran would have been had it not went off onto a path of becoming a rogue state. As this legislation details, today the regime flagrantly disregards commitments it's made to respect the fundamental rights of the Iranian people. Many of us recall the barbaric mass executions carried out over a 4-month period in 1988. And I dare say, if you know any Persians, if you know people who escaped from Iran, you know that during that period of time leading up to 1988, there were over 30,000 students and young professionals who lost their lives as a consequence. We know that the political prisoners there went through a grueling experience. In Evin prison and other prisons, many were executed by hanging, many by firing squad. They refused to renounce their political affiliations, and that was the fate that was handed out to them. And today, the regime still persecutes ethnic and religious minority groups, such as the Baha'i, Christians, of course, Sufi, Sunni, dissenting Shia Muslims. And we all remember the way the Ayatollah brutally suppressed the peaceful political dissent during the Green Revolution, during which the previous administration remained embarrassingly silent, in my view, and many of us here on this floor today spoke up often at that time about that dissent during the Green Revolution, because I think this was a real opportunity missed by the United States. So, again, Mr. Speaker, I want to thank Chairman McCall and I want to thank Ranking Member Engel for their leadership on this legislation. I am glad we have strong bipartisan support for this measure. Regardless of how one views the Iran nuclear agreement, it is critical that the United States and our allies continue to press Iran for its dangerous and threatening acts that fall outside of the JCPOA. And this is an area where officials from both the Trump and Obama administrations agree, and they agree for good reason here. Remember, this is the same regime that is holding American citizens, including one who is in very poor health, holding them on sham charges in one of the largest ransom schemes, from my standpoint, that was ever devised. This regime, of course, held its first American hostages in 1979 when it overran our U.S. Embassy. The regime's M.O. remains the same. It is far past time the regime faced consequences for its attacks on Iranians and for its attacks on Americans alike. I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from New York is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I rise in strong support of this measure and yield myself as much time as I may consume.
Gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, let me start by thanking Congressmen Deutsch and McCall, both valued members of the Foreign Affairs Committee, for their hard work on this bill. I want to also thank our Chairman Ed Royce, who has been a strong bipartisan voice in things that are so important to the country, our country, and to the world. And we always say that we take pride in having the Foreign Affairs Committee being the most bipartisan committee in the entire Congress. Iran has isolated itself on the global stage because it refuses to abandon a range of aggressive activities that pose a threat to the region and a threat to the entire international community. On that list is the regime's terrible mistreatment of its own people, and its heinous practice of prolonged and politically motivated detentions of American citizens. The bill before us now seeks to put an end to these intolerable practices. It would place sanctions on anyone responsible for politically motivated harassment, abuse, extortion, or extended detention or trial of Americans or Iranians. Earlier this year, we stood on this floor in solidarity with protesters in Iran who sought a better future for their country and for the next generation. They wanted to see their government abandon its support for Iranian proxy forces and terrorist groups like Hezbollah in favor of funding health care and employment opportunities for average Iranians. This is a country that has suffered so much under the Ayatollahs and the economic mismanagement of its leaders. And the protests in December and January were a stark reminder of the regime's tight grip on power, as many protesters were killed in the streets and blocked from communicating with the outside world. Today, as we pass this legislation, we think about the Americans who currently sit in Iranian prisons. We think about Robert Levinson, Mr. Deutsch's constituent, who has been missing for over 11 years. Who has missed the weddings of his children and the births of his grandchildren. The Iranian regime had promised to cooperate with the investigation to locate Mr. Levinson, but to that date, that cooperation has been virtually non-existent. There is no real clarity in U.S. policy toward Iran. The United States faces a looming deadline on the nuclear deal, and the future remains uncertain. But there is one thing we can all agree. We cannot let up the pressure on Iran for its human rights violations, particularly against American citizens. So again, I want to thank Mr. McCall and Mr. Deutsch for doing a great job with this. This is a bipartisan piece of legislation. If you care about the injustices going on in Iran, then it's important to support this bill, and I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves.
I
Gentleman
yield
from
5 minutes to the gentleman from Texas, Mr. McCall, chairman of the Committee on Homeland Security and the author of this bill.
Gentleman from Texas recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today to urge support for my bill to hold the Iranian regime accountable for its continued human rights violations. I introduced the Iran Human Rights and Hostage-Taking Accountability Act with Congressman Deutsch, and I'm grateful for Chairman Royce and Ranking Member Engel's support in this effort. The Iranian regime continues to perpetrate gross human rights abuses against its own people. They continue to suppress and censor their people's calls for democratic reform. They recklessly use their nation's resources to expand their destabilizing influence and support of terrorism. And they continue to engage in corrupt practices. And they continue to illegally detain and imprison our citizens without just cause. This is simply unacceptable. Mr. Speaker, this bill serves as a clear signal to the people of Iran that we support their quest for freedom. It shines a light on their regime's human rights violations and targets Iranian officials guilty of corruption, censorship, and the diversion of goods intended for the Iranian people. It requires the President to work with our international partners to develop a strategy to end this inhumane behavior and sanctions those officials complicit in those crimes. And finally, it sanctions those individuals who take Americans hostage. Mr. Speaker, today there are more than 6 American citizens and permanent U.S. residents held by the Iranian regime in a shameful attempt to use innocent human lives as political bargaining chips. These hostages include Bob Levinson, Congressman Deutsch's constituent, who has been missing since 2007 and remains America's longest held hostage. Siamak Namazi and his 81-year-old father, Bakr, held since 2015 and 16, respectively. PhD student Jiewei Wang, held since 2016. And internet freedom activist Nizar Zaka, held since 2016, and others. The United States has a moral responsibility to devote resources to these hostages and make their return a priority. I sent a letter with Congressman Liu and 46 other members of Congress requesting that the administration keep Congress informed as to what steps they are taking to guarantee this happens. So again, I want to thank the chairman, ranking member, Congressman Deutsch, for their leadership in this bipartisan effort to hold Iran accountable. And with that, I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman from California reserves. Gentleman from New York is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's now my pleasure to yield 5 minutes to the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Deutsch, the ranking member of the Subcommittee on the Middle East and North Africa of the Foreign Affairs Committee.
Gentleman from Florida is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you, Ranking Member Engel and Chairman Royce, for your support of this legislation. And special thanks to my colleague, Chairman McCall, for your leadership in recognizing the need to take action. We must work together to stop the brutal Iranian regime's human rights abuses and demand the release of American hostages that Iran is using as pawns for political leverage. I'm proud to partner with you, Mr. McCall, in this effort. The Iran Human Rights and Hostage-Taking Accountability Act sends a clear message to the Iranian regime and to the rest of the world. This Congress, this country will not tolerate the flagrant disregard of the most basic of human rights. My colleagues have explained the merits of this bill, and I know it is difficult for many Americans to imagine. But we are here today to show our resolve in the face of really unbelievable circumstances. For my constituents, the family of Robert Levinson, this is a nightmare that they have lived for 11 years. Bob Levinson is the longest held American hostage in history. He disappeared in Iran on March 9th, 2007. Imagine 11 years without your husband or your father. Imagine having grandchildren who have never had the chance to meet their grandfather. Imagine 11 anniversaries, dozens of family birthdays and holidays that passed by without Bob, just an empty place where Bob should be sitting. Bob's wife, Christine, and his 7 children, Susan, Stephanie, Sarah, Dan, David, Samantha, and Doug, have been tireless advocates for their father. They've traveled to Iran themselves looking for answers. They have made the trip to Washington, D.C. countless times to meet with government officials, members of Congress. They have fought for action all the way to the Oval Office, directly appealing to President Bush, President Obama, and President Trump. They have watched as others have returned home to their families. They have listened with hope as Iran's leaders have promised cooperation. And they have been disappointed more times than they can count as promises go unfulfilled year after year after year. Iran has become adept at this cruel game because that is what it is to this rogue Iranian regime. They say that hostages are not hostages, but these people are not detained under a legal order. They have lost their freedom. They have been separated from their families, and they have been held under the shamelessly trumped up and false charges. Any attempt to show due process or trials has been a sham. To the Levinsons, to the Namazi family, the Zaka family, the Wang family, and the other families whose loved ones are being held, we stand with you. Today we speak clearly and loudly with one bipartisan voice to send the message that no country, no rogue regime will use American lives as leverage to further a dangerous agenda. This bill isn't about the nuclear deal. Nothing in this bill precludes our continued participation in the JCPOA, but this bill makes clear the importance of closely coordinating with our allies and partners whose citizens have also been held hostage by Iran to apply pressure on the regime. If we're going to counter Iran's abuses, Iran's terrorism, Iran's threats to our troops and our national security interests, we must work in tandem with our partners around the globe. We will stand together against repression and the violation of human rights. We will stand together against religious persecution. We will stand together for the rule of law and democratic values. And taking hostages and violating the most fundamental values that cut to the core of our dignity as human beings is unacceptable to this Congress and to members of the international community. I urge all of my colleagues to stand up to Iran's rogue regime, to stand up for human rights and for the people of Iran, to stand with the Levinsons and the other families whose loved ones are missing from their lives, and to fight for their return home by supporting this bill. Please support H.R. 4744, and together we will stand for basic human rights. I yield back.
The gentleman from New York reserves. Gentleman from California.
I yield 3 minutes to the gentlelady from Florida, Eliana Ross-Layton, who chairs the Foreign Affairs Subcommittee on the Middle East and North Africa.
Gentleman from Florida. Gentlelady from Florida is recognized.
Thank you so much, Mr. Speaker, and I thank Chairman Royce for his kindness and his leadership, and Ranking Member Elliott, my favorite mensch, for bringing this bill to the floor today. And I also want to thank and congratulate Michael McCall and my South Florida colleague and dear friend Ted Deutsch for their work in authoring this important bill. The regime in Iran, as we have heard from my colleagues, is responsible for some of the most despicable human rights abuses imaginable. The regime is also notorious for its hostage-taking tactics, hoping to get financial or political concessions from the United States and other Western countries for their hostage-taking. Mr. Deutsch and I have been highlighting these abuses in our subcommittee through multiple hearings, many pieces of legislation, including a resolution that the House passed last year, House Resolution 317, that urged the President to make the release of Americans held hostage in Iran the highest of priorities. We also held a hearing on some of the hostages named in the resolution, where we heard from family members of Mr. Deutsch's constituent, Bob Levinson, who is America's longest held hostage ever, Bakr and Siamak Namazi, father and son, who have been unjustly detained in Iran for far too long, Nizar Zaka. All of these families have had to endure so much, Mr. Speaker. Almost 1 year later, after our resolution, all of these men, as well as at least 4 other Americans, additional Americans, continue to be unjustly detained in Iran, suffering under horrific conditions with little to no contact with their families. Iran must be held accountable, Mr. Speaker. We need to be applying maximum pressure against the regime, and this bill gives the administration more tools to sanction the regime for this practice of taking hostages, and I offer my full support. I thank our esteemed chairman of our committee, as well as my friend, the ranking member. Thank you for the time, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Gentleman from California reserves. Gentleman from New York is recognized.
I reserve.
Gentleman from California.
I yield 3 minutes to the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Poe, chairman of the Foreign Affairs Subcommittee on Terrorism, Nonproliferation, and Trade.
Gentleman from Texas recognized.
Mr. Speaker, the Iranian regime is the #1 state sponsor of terror in the whole world, and they commit terrorist acts even against their own people. So I'm proud to support H.R. 4744, the Iranian Human Rights and Hostage-Taking Accountability Act, introduced by my friend, Chairman McCall. The mullahs in Tehran are among the world's worst human rights abusers. This year, we have witnessed their brutality again on display as they continue to mercilessly crush dissent from their own people. International attention has faded, but the Iranian people are still in the streets demanding their rights, whether they be economic opportunity, access to water, religious freedom, or gender equality. So in response, the regime has murdered dozens and locked up thousands, as it has done so many times before, without punishment from the outside world. This is nothing new for the Islamic Republic. Look no further than the 1988 massacre, where 30,000 of Iranians' political prisoners were systematically murdered by the regime. This barbaric mass execution occurred by public hangings, firing squads, including teenagers and pregnant women who refused to renounce their political affiliations, including many of the MEK, today's leading Iranian dissident group. So horrific was the act that the deputy to Iran's ruler at the time, Ayatollah Khomeini, called it, quote, the greatest crime committed during the Islamic Republic for which history will condemn us. And yes, history now condemns the regime for these acts of murder. This bill will provide that commendation and call for investigation into this crime against humanity. It also urges our government to work with international partners and investigate other major human rights abuses, such as the dozens more killed during protests in 1999, 2009, and 2017, and sanction those responsible. In all cases, the families of those murdered by the regime were never told what happened to their loved ones' remains. This important bill will pressure the Iranian government to disclose where the final resting place of the missing is, so their families may have a small bit of peace. Mr. Speaker, now is the day of reckoning for the Iranian regime, and that's just the way it is. I'll yield back.
Gentleman from California, do you have any more speakers? Gentleman from California reserves. Gentleman from New York is recognized.
I'll continue to reserve the right to close.
Well, I'll close, and I yield myself as much time as I might consume. Mr. Speaker, it's no secret that the United States and Iran's leaders are at odds on a host of issues. Iran has killed Americans in Iraq. Its proxies seek to harm our citizens and our interests around the world. But let me be clear, the United States has no quarrel with the Iranian people. This legislation seeks to protect the human rights of the Iranian people and Americans who are unfairly detained in Iran. This bill signifies and signals our solidarity with the protesters and demonstrators to Iran's rulers that any action that violates the human rights of an American will be met with severe consequences. Gentleman from Texas, Mr. Poe, just mentioned the 1988 massacre. That was horrendous, and there were many, many more. This brutal regime has blood on its hands, and it's important for the United States to call them out. I urge my colleagues to support this bill, support this bipartisan bill, and I yield the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back his time. Gentleman from California is recognized.
In closing, I would again like to thank my colleagues, Chairman McCall and Ranking Member Engel, for their bipartisan leadership to hold Iran accountable, for their brutality in the 1988 massacres, their brutality in terms of the way they're treating their religious minorities today. And we know that Americans formerly imprisoned by Iran describe being subjected to electric shock and whippings. We've heard that before our committee. We've heard them say that they were denied medical care. Today, U.S. citizens such as Siamak and Bakr Namazi and Shiyue Wang and U.S. permanent resident Nazar Zakah are all sitting in Iranian jails on bogus accusations of collaborating with a hostile government or espionage. And U.S. citizen Robert Levinson is still missing, and that's more than 10 years after he disappeared in Iran. Our hearts go out to these victims. Our hearts go out to their families as we renew our call for the immediate release of all U.S. citizens and permanent residents held in Iran. With this legislation, we will impose tough sanctions on the regime. And we do that for its corruption, for its attacks on innocent Americans, and its attacks on Iranians alike. I yield back the balance of my time.